Good evening and welcome to a very special interview show of the Prode. Today we turn our attention to the ongoing situation in Tibet, an issue that continues to raise deep humanitarian and cultural concerns. Over the years, international observers have highlighted significant restrictions on cultural and religious expression, as well as broader questions around autonomy and human rights. The Tibetan community, both within the region and in exile, have worked tirelessly to preserve its identity and draw attention to these challenges on the global stage. To help us understand this complex landscape, we are honored to be joined by the member of Scottish Parliament, Ross Greer, who is also the co-convener of the cross-party group on Tibet in the Scottish Parliament. Ross, thank you for being here to begin our conversation. Given your close work within the Tibetan community and the Tibetan government in exile, how do you view the ongoing situation in Tibet, and what are some of the key concerns being raised, and how do they shape the work you are doing through the Scottish Parliament or through your own advocacy?
Yeah, I've actually just returned from Dharamsala from McLeod Ganj, where I was with the Tibetan government for about a week and a half catching up. And it's a state of profound crisis, frankly. When our trip was arranged, it was long before the Americans announced that they were going to cut all of the USAID programming, the NDI, NED programming, so much programming that the Tibetans and plenty of other groups rely on. But by the time we got there, that announcement had come through, and only about 9% of the Tibetan government's budget comes from the contribution of Tibetans in exile. The rest of it is grant funding. So everywhere we went, every school we visited, every hospital, every vaccine centre had American government branding on it. So there's a real profound state of crisis now about how to support the Tibetan community in exile, but also how to support Tibetans who are still in Tibet under occupation from the Chinese. Things like the Radio Free Asia programming that so many Tibetans rely on to get uncensored news from the outside world. This is a really dangerous place. And unfortunately, what America's doing, not just in terms of cutting that aid funding, but the tariffs that Trump has introduced are pushing other countries closer to China, which has, we hope, no knock-on effect, but we think that there's a real risk of a knock-on effect on how willing other countries are to stand up for the Tibetan people, to support the government in exile, but more importantly, frankly, to support Tibetans who are still living under that occupation.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you were in India. So how do you see Indian government supports towards Tibetan community? Do you think the support is significant, or do you think there is a need for improvement in that?
It's incredible the achievements that we've seen so far with the Indian government. Since 1959, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama arrived in India, multiple different governments of different parties, whether it's Congress, BJP, others, that support for the Tibetan exile struggle is so important. India's the world's largest democracy. I think there's a lot of sympathy in India for what's happened to the people of Tibet. And obviously, India as a major bulwark against China is really important to the geopolitics of Asia and the wider world. But again, we're seeing this real risk here of American tariffs on everyone, on every country, including on India. There's a real risk that puts pressure on the Indian government to improve their relations with China, and the Tibetans could potentially be very much at risk as a result of that. It was so clear the time that I spent in Dharamsala, but also the years I've worked for the Tibetan government, just how grateful, just the government in exile are, but the whole Tibetan exile community are for the hospitality of the Indian people for all these decades. Anything America does to jeopardize that by pushing other countries, particularly India, but also Nepal and Bhutan, closer to China, that's a huge risk to the Tibetan struggle.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you work very closely with the Tibetan government and also with the Indian government and a lot of political parties. So, I mean, my question to you would be that Indian government presently, specifically the BJP government, has been very hesitant in talking about Tibetan issues, and especially talking about His Holiness the Dalai Lama because to maintain and because to balance relationship with People's Republic of China. So, how do you see all this, and where do you think the future is heading towards as far as Indian government stand on Tibetan issues is concerned?
I think the Indian government needs a real reset of its policy approach towards Tibet, occupied Tibet, and the approach towards China, not just in terms of support for democratic struggle and people's right to self-determination, and it is right to support the freedom that the Tibetan people aspire to, but the self-interest of the Indian people as well. About something like 3 billion people, potentially as much as 4 billion, more than half the world's population, are relying to some extent on food that is grown using water supplies that come off the Tibetan plateau into India. There's 1 billion people whose water supplies are directly a result of the water coming off the Tibetan plateau. But the Tibetan plateau is warming faster than anywhere else on the planet. The effect of climate change there is absolutely profound, and India will be really directly affected by that. We saw recently, I think it's 2 years ago, the severe water shortages in Chennai. We're going to see that more and more frequently, heat waves, droughts, etc. But unless India can exert some pressure on China to at least protect and preserve the environment of Tibet, obviously we want to see the human rights of the Tibetans respected, but for India, there's a real direct risk from the environmental destruction that China is inflicting on Tibet, because that is India's water supply, and as a result, that's India's food supply as well. And it is difficult. China is an incredibly powerful country. They are not afraid to exert pressure and to bully other countries. You've seen that here in Scotland. But as well as, I think, India's long-standing support for the Tibetan people and for democracy itself as a concept, there's a straightforward self-interest position here, because if the Tibetan plateau continues to melt and be destroyed by the Chinese at the rate it currently is, that in the next few years will put India in a state of profound crisis in relation to its water and food supply.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on, and what is your observation on Washington DC's supports towards Tibet? Do you think in present administration there is a growing support for the Tibetan cause, considering Donald Trump's not, quote unquote, not so very good relations with China?
It's so hard to tell with the Trump administration. Marco Rubio, their Secretary of State, historically was a very strong supporter of the Tibetan people, of the Tibetan cause, a very strong opponent of China. But so many of Marco Rubio's other positions he has ditched completely. So it's impossible to know whether he still believes. He probably still does believe in everything he said up until now. But clearly as Secretary of State, he's taking his instructions from Trump. And support for Tibet in America has historically been very bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats have come together. We recently saw a new Tibet Act passed in Congress in America. Really important, that particularly on the issue of the reincarnation, the succession for the Dalai Lama, America has made it very clear that the regime in Beijing does not get to pick the next Dalai Lama. That is incredibly, incredibly important. And also things like reciprocal access, demanding access to Tibet to see what the situation of the Tibetan people is. But we cannot shy away from the fact that the decisions that the Trump administration have taken, the massive cuts to USAID, the cuts to other pro-democracy programming like Radio Free Asia, that is all going to have a disastrous impact for the Tibetan people in exile, who depend significantly for their schools, their hospitals, so much of their civil administration on that American support, but also for people in Tibet, very often whose only source of free information are those Radio Free Asia broadcasts. So like the current American administration, the Trump administration, is a massive existential threat to the Tibetan people. Separate from that, there is still that strong bipartisan support in Congress from members of the House and the Senate. And what I would want to see is for more of them to stand up, particularly Republicans, to stand up to Trump and say, no, support for the Tibetan struggle and effective opposition to China is more important, because that's not what we're seeing so far. If Donald Trump wants a trade war with China, he shouldn't be trying to start a trade war with every other country on the planet at the same time. That's what he's done. It's pushed countries like Japan and South Korea closer to China. That's going to be pretty disastrous in the long term.
Yeah, and now also coming to UK's supports towards Tibet. So how do you see UK's government, especially Keir Starmer and Secretary Lamy's supports toward Tibet? Do you think they are doing something very significant in this area? And what do you think are the areas of improvement? Also, since you are a member of the Scottish Parliament, and I'm aware the Scottish Parliament have committees on, cross-party groups on Ukraine, India. So do you have something like for Tibet in that regard?
Yes, I'm the chair of the Scottish Parliament's cross-party group on Tibet. So that wasn't how my involvement in supporting the Tibetan people started, but for the last few years, I've been very proud to have that position. And it was in that role that I was in Dharamsala with the Tibetan government, Parliament, and then meeting with His Holiness. The UK's position on China, I think, has been pretty disastrous. At least historically in America, there has been pretty robust opposition to Chinese influence. The UK has been the opposite. And we've seen that whether it is welcoming in Chinese companies, buying up and building infrastructure here in the UK, which is a massive security risk, or in the UK government, whether it's the current government or the Labour government or the previous Conservative government, constantly trying to reset relations with China on the basis of trade, seeing the relationship with China being all about trade. That's not how the Chinese see it. That's not how their regime see it. They are trying to exert maximum influence. And we saw that in Scotland recently. Edinburgh, our capital city, wanted to enter into a twinning agreement, friendship agreement with a city in Taiwan. And the Chinese consulate told the Scottish government, if that happens, we will ban Chinese students from your universities. Our two largest universities, Glasgow and Edinburgh, are essentially financially dependent on Chinese students. So what the Chinese consulate was doing was threatening to collapse, to bankrupt our two largest universities for the sake of a twinning arrangement, a purely symbolic friendship arrangement. And to me, that is the result of years and decades, a really naive approach to China from the UK and from the Scottish government. The Scottish government has constantly tried to take a trade-first approach to its relationship with China. That's a mistake, because that's not how the Chinese are approaching this, and we need to get much smarter about that. Of course, in 2008, the UK government grotesquely betrayed the Tibetan people because basically we needed Chinese bailout money during the Great Recession. So the UK has a historical responsibility to Tibet. It was the UK government that signed the Shimla Convention, that treaty that was the UK, Tibet and China, which was an excellent example of the fact that Tibet is a nation. It's a nation under occupation. The UK wouldn't have signed the Shimla Convention with Tibet if Tibet was not a nation with its own government. But we've essentially completely ignored that. I think what we need to see from the UK is a much, much more robust response to China. Whether that is on matters of trade, of China dumping products in other markets to undermine domestic manufacturing, for example, but also issues of national security or infrastructure. Look, we've had surveillance, Chinese spying on elected members of parliament here. That is utterly, utterly unacceptable. And we need a much more robust response to that. The critical area in Scotland is education. So we had this example of Chinese students at our universities. So far as I'm aware, Scotland also has more Confucius institutes per head of population than any other country on earth, both the universities and the school classroom institutes. That puts us in a massively overexposed position. China sees Scotland and Wales as these soft entry points into the United Kingdom, and I think we need to get much smarter in Scotland at protecting our own national interest, but also standing up for our values, and our values include human rights, freedom and democracy. That means standing with the people of Tibet, the people of Hong Kong, the Uyghurs. There are 2 million Uyghurs in Chinese concentration camps. There are 1 million Tibetan children who've been kidnapped and put into boarding schools. Think of our response to Russia and what Russia's done kidnapping Ukrainian children. We should have the same response to what China's doing to the children of Tibet. They are trying within a single generation to destroy the Tibetan language and culture. Britain needs to do something about that because Britain is still a significant global player and we have a historic responsibility here.
Yeah. What would be your final message to the global community out there and people who are not much aware about these issues? Because when we talk about the crises around the world, mostly the attention is on Eastern Europe or on West Asia, but not a lot of conversations around the world is happening around Tibet. So how would we better that, and what would be your message to the global community?
Global democracy is under massive threat and strain right now. Democratic countries, whether it's India, the United Kingdom, the United States, are under a huge amount of pressure internally and externally. There are actors trying to undermine our democratic rights and freedoms. And that is in the interest of the regime in Beijing. That is in the interest of China. And they play the long game here. In our democracies, we tend to think in 3, 4, 5-year cycles until the next election. A Chinese regime that doesn't need to be re-elected by its people isn't thinking like that. They're thinking 10, 20, 100 years in advance. So we need to be much smarter about that. A part of it is about our shared values. I think people in democracies, we know how valuable it is that we can go to the polling station and we can choose who our government is. We can say what we want. We can criticize our government. I could criticize the UK Labour government. I could criticize the BJP in India. I could criticize Trump in the United States. You cannot do that in China. The people of China don't have that freedom. The people of occupied Tibet certainly don't have that freedom. But as well as the human rights and the respect for international human rights, the freedom of all people, there is a collective self-interest thing here. Tibet is the world's 3rd largest store of ice after the North and South Pole, but it is melting quicker than anywhere else. It is warming quicker than anywhere else on the planet as a result of global warming and of China's intense industrialization and destructive efforts there. That is going to cause a catastrophe for the global food and water supplies, particularly for countries in India and South Asia. But something like 4 billion people's food depends on the water that flows off the Tibetan plateau, India, of course, being a massive food exporter to the rest of the world. So it is in our collective interest to make sure that we are not just supporting the struggle of the Tibetan people, but that the Tibetan plateau, the nation, the land of Tibet, is being protected, because we are very quickly heading towards a global crisis when it comes to food and water. And in a situation like that, conflict is almost inevitable. Conflict between nations, between peoples, over things as fundamental as water is something that we need to avoid. And if we want to avoid that, if we want to secure our own futures, to make sure that our children don't have to go and fight in these wars, then making sure we take a robust approach to China now, that we protect Tibet, the land and its people, that's in everyone's interests.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate the efforts which you are doing for the Tibetan community and in general the democratic community around the world. Really appreciate you being here, and hope so the world would be a better place to live in.
Thank you very much. You do.